Philanthropy was not invented in the United States in the 20th century with tax deductions. It's as old as any civilization that we know of, any society that we know of, anywhere in the world. And what I mean by that, I want to define philanthropy for our purposes because I think it helps us understand how it really functions and how different philanthropy systems came into existence. And I would like to define philanthropy as the voluntary sharing of resources for public good. A recent study that came out, and I saw literally just this morning by CAF, demonstrates that philanthropy, defined in those terms, is far more generous in the global South than it is in the wealthier North. And the reason for that is because so much of philanthropy around the world is based on voluntarism. And so much of it is based on the percentage of our own personal assets and wealth that we have that we make available to others. And so that the study shows that by any of those standards, the global South far outpaces what we do in the United States for all of our sophisticated institutions. It outpaces Europe and parts of Latin America as well. So that it's nothing. Not only is it not new, but it exists everywhere in the world. Many people around the world, until they began to study it, and certainly in the United States, sometimes think that American philanthropy is superior, is better. And the reason for that is because we have more philanthropically related institutions and systems than most other places. But there's a real question, as we're going to see as we go through, is it better in terms of how it serves, how the society serves citizens? I want to remind you, as I say, to finish the history part before we get into the modernity, is that not only is philanthropy existing in lots of places, but there's evidence that in Christian writings, in Muslim writings, and in Jewish writings, it's considered obligatory. If one looks at writings of Ibn Khaldun, most significant Muslim legalist, or Maimonides, a significant legalist in the Jewish world, or Thomas Aquinas, certainly a well-known Christian thinker. But modernity began to change everything. Now, bear in mind, pre-modern and postmodern, there were always super wealthy people. The history of philanthropy that I'm talking about is not dependent on the history of kings, is not dependent on the history of nobility and aristocracy. It's not a study of the Astors and the Carnegies and the Rockefellers. It may make reference to them. The philanthropy that really matters to us is the everyday philanthropy that really ties society together. There's always a place for super wealthy. That's both a challenge and opportunity, but it's its own discussion. And we have to avoid the nature of voyeuristic philanthropy. Our decisions in this class are based on what I would consider to be everyday philanthropy, that all decisions that all of us have to make. So we began to see the change in the beginning of modernity when there was a challenge to the way things had always been done. In the United States, which was made up of rejection of the colonial systems, were largely a rejection of the European concept of things. When the colonies came together in 1776 and wrote the Declaration of Independence, there was a significant defining statement in that Declaration of Independence, which we have to take seriously. That all men, and listen carefully because we hear it with all sorts of 21st century connotations that we have to take very seriously, but it says that all men were created with inalienable rights, and those rights are the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. One of those has particular relevance to philanthropy, but I want to just clarify what the first two mean. When we say that people are guaranteed the right to life, those who are lawyers in the room, and since we're not together, I don't know who's a lawyer and who's not a lawyer. But if you were a lawyer, I would call upon you to describe what habeas corpus means. For those that don't know, the Latin means you have a life. What it refers to actually is something quite profound. It means that before this time, you didn't own yourself. You were owned by the king or the czar or whoever controlled the society owned you. You didn't own yourself. With the beginning of modernity, one of the most profound changes in industrialized society was the commitment that says you're not owned by anybody else as an individual. You own yourself. So you have the right to your own life. It's not defined by somebody else unless there's extraordinary circumstances that allow that to be taken. Liberty. That's an easy one. It means that we have the right to define what society, what government we want. Do we want a democracy? Do we want a republic? Do we want some sort of monarchy? Do we want some combination thereof? We have a right to determine what governance we have. But in the United States, the third one is the most intriguing of all. And what does it say? We have the right to the pursuit of happiness. That's the most subjective way of defining rights that one can imagine. It means that we have a right to decide how we want to live our lives, what we want to believe, where we want to live, what professions we want to practice. It's up to us. It's up to us to decide what our life looks like. It's not up to a king to tell us where we have to live. It's not up to it's not up to a government to tell us what kind of job we can have, what kind of education we're allowed to have, and so forth. So the pursuit of happiness is really what opens up the nature of the uniqueness of American society, for better and for worse, because it leads to this concept of radical individualism. Now, before we go further with that, recognizing that we don't only have Americans on this call, I want to point out, let's take the most well-known example of a different perspective that took place, and that's the French Revolution. And what did the French Revolution espouse? Instead of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, it said liberté, égalité, and fraternité. All right, liberty, the right to decide what government you have. Equality, that all people within that society have a claim. But the third one is very different. The third one is a social concept, not an individual concept. Fraternity means that we're connected to each other in a social fashion. And that had real implications, especially after in the post-Napoleonic way in which societies were put together. That meant that there was a social compact where the government had a responsibility to its citizens. Whereas in the American system, the government had to afford you the right to be an individual, but didn't promise you a right to but didn't mandate that there was a social compact that we had as citizens. It led to a very different understandings, and we're going to look at them a little bit carefully. So that distinction is important. How does it play out? Very quickly, we're going to come to this later on. Quickly, in the Napoleonic system, education is covered, healthcare is covered, retirement is covered, the vacations are mandated. There's a way in which the society has an obligation to its citizens as an extension of what does it mean to have a social compact. We in the United States don't assume that that social compact exists. And that's why so much of our systems and so much of our nonprofit systems and some of our social systems depend on voluntarism and voluntary contributions and voluntary participation. Had radically different directions. We're going to come back to the rest of the industrialized world a little bit later. Now I want to come back to the United States because that's really where this gets played out in some very distinctive ways. So it's fine for everybody to say that, by the way, this next section, I want you to listen carefully because there's going to be a homework assignment embedded in the next few paragraphs. So pay attention, please. It's fine for everybody to say that we want radical individualism. That's terrific until you get sick. Or everybody wants radical individualism until your house catches fire. Or everybody wants radical individualism until there's such a thing as orphans or widows or people that have very genuine needs for education. And so what we began to see early on was not the pressure for government to intervene, but what I coined the phrase, the naturally occurring philanthropy organizations. What does that mean? It meant that if there's a fire, the likelihood is that you couldn't put the fire out in your own home if you're living in a city. You needed other people to do it, to help you with that. And so that led to the development of mutual aid societies, so that if your house caught fire, the word would go out to everybody that was part of that society who could participate and help you put the fire out, and you would do the same for somebody else. It led to, and so the need for people to organize to meet social needs didn't disappear because of radical individualism, but rather it emerged from a need base over a period of time. There were some needs that were based on ideology. We're meeting in Philadelphia, and those of you that are not in Philadelphia, I made a reference to it being the birthplace of the Declaration of Independence of American government. Philadelphia was also the place of the first free library, and you know who founded it? Two wealthy philanthropists, Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin. Why did they create a free library for this new emerging American society? The reason for that is because they believed strongly in democracy. They came to the conclusion that an illiterate populace is not able to exercise the rights and privileges of what a democracy is about. However, books before the end of the 19th century were very expensive. Maybe somebody would have a Bible or a reader in their own home. If one wanted an educated populace, one had to make books available. So you had wealthy people like Franklin and Jefferson come together and said, we're going to make a free library available for everyone, so that the literacy is possible for every single citizen. A couple generations later, we saw that Carnegie did something similar to that. It was really derived from this innovation. And there are other examples of that as well. And so that we saw that the need for associations, voluntary associations, emerged out of either ideological need or practical human need, that despite this concept of radical individualism, that the pursuit of happiness seems to lead to. So then the next question, and here's where I want you to pay attention, because the homework assignment, it really emerges from this, is the question is, what was the basis on which these associations were organized? And what I'd like you to do, make a note to yourself, and we're going to talk about a little bit in the class, wherever you live, do a little bit of homework and see if you can identify the oldest hospital in your community. See if it still exists, see what its name is today. The likelihood is, if it still exists today, it has merged or some other kind of name. And who organized it? Who were the organizers of that hospital? If for any reason, and I don't think that's going to be true, because I don't know where you're all from, if for some reason you can't find any information about the original hospital, see what you can find about the oldest social service organization in your community. But you should be able to find a hospital, and let's talk about it. But what we find was that just as there were fire brigades, and as you'll see from some of the pictures that are going to show, most of the nonprofit organizations, the hospitals, the orphanages, the places for widows, the places for people that had infectious diseases, were organized either by religious groups or by national ethnic groups. It could be German, it could be Irish, it could be Italian, and even German, it could be Prussian, it could be Bavarian, it could be Polish, it could be Czech, it could be French, it could be from all sorts of places, or it might be Methodist or Presbyterian or Episcopalian or Quaker. Interestingly enough, those of you that happen to come across hospitals that or other institutions that have Jewish roots or have Catholic roots will discover that those are not typically referred to as a Jewish hospital or Catholic hospital. Until well into the 20th century, to call something Jewish or Catholic was socially at a lower level than calling something Episcopalian or Presbyterian or Quaker or Methodist. But nevertheless, you're going to find that in various places in the world, there are very prominent hospitals and very prominent social service organizations that bear the name or their roots are Presbyterian or Episcopalian. Was there something really different about healthcare practice by the Presbyterians from the Episcopalians or the Methodists or the Quakers on the whole? No. The reason for that is because most people in the cities in which we're talking about from the development of the colonial period all the way through the middle of the 19th century, most people organized on the basis of ethnic or religious roots. And so it was just a natural phenomenon that if you needed to have a place for people to be taken care of on a healthcare basis, they were going to go to the place that was organized by their own religious organization. You see and by the way, if any of you are from New York, you probably recognize the Presbyterian Hospital as now the Columbia Presbyterian Hospital because of the merger. Columbia did not. Columbia comes out of the university healthcare. Presbyterian was an large independent hospital. They merged. I guarantee that if you were to go to the Columbia Presbyterian Hospital today on the Upper East Side of New York City, you will not find anything very different about anything very Presbyterian about that healthcare, any more than if you went to the Methodist Hospital in Brooklyn, or if you went to the Swedish hospital in Seattle. The first major change to philanthropy, and this change that took place is not only an American phenomenon, but an international phenomenon where there was industrialization. Because industrialization brought about radical changes in the essential economic structure of societies, but more than that, the social structures of society. Whereas before then, yes, it's true that the super wealthy may have lived in palatial estates and somewhere, but the normally wealthy people didn't live very far from the people who were very poor. And everyone knew that the wealthy person may have lived 2 blocks away in a very big house, and that person in the very big house probably knew the name of the person 2 blocks away who became a widow or an orphan, and therefore they were able to participate and give money very directly to take care of those needs. With industrialization, all sorts of changes took place. There was a need for many more people with different kinds of educational or cultural backgrounds to work in factories. Those factories were less pleasant places to live around. Many of them smelled. Many of them had detritus that filled the streets. They were and when possible, so that there were throngs of people that upset the way in which the social structures that existed before. If one had enough money, one moved away from where the industry was, uptown, where the air was cleaner, or the streets were cleaner, or there was less riffraff, hoi polloi, that were available all the time, people who spoke different languages, different accents, different education. So the wealthier you were, the more likely it was that you would move away from where industry took place. There's all sorts of implications in terms of industrialization. I now want to, in our limited time, I want to talk about the philanthropic implication of this, because it was what led to the development of the primary institutions that defined much of 20th century philanthropy in the United States, and to a lesser degree in the rest of the industrialized world. Because what happened with the process of industrialization, as I just said, was that the wealthy were no longer living near where the poor were. In other words, they had less access. The people who had the real need, the genuine objective need, no longer had access to the people who had the means. Now, that didn't mean in any of the places where there were wealthy people that the wealthy people stopped taking the poor seriously. What it meant was that they were very aware that they were not in a position to judge who had what need. They didn't know the people that became widowed or orphaned or sick. They needed somebody to be an intermediary for them. They needed there to be somebody who was going to come to them and say, we know that there's a need for this number of people who are immigrants or widowed lately. And so that it began to develop the intermediary institutions such as community foundations, such as United Way, such as Catholic Charities, such as Protestant philanthropies, such as Jewish federations. Those were intermediary organizations that came into existence beginning at the latter part of the 19th century and well into the first couple of decades of the 20th century. There was barely a community around the United States and in most of the industrialized Europe that did not have some sort of intermediary organization to be able to make it possible to collect money from the rich to give to the poor. Now, let me tell you how this worked. It didn't work in the way we do philanthropy today. The way it worked was that there were a number of organizations that were designated as agents of the community to provide those services. There might have been a single orphanage that was designated, or a single place for widows and widowers or elderly, and so forth. Then there was a single place that there were the agents of the organized community. They would come every year. There were nonprofits, don't forget, literal nonprofits. They did not have a surplus. They would come every year to the organization that represented them, such as the United Way, and they would say, this is our deficit for the year. The United Way or the Jewish Federation or the Catholic Charities would convene the wealthy people in the community and say, this is our deficit for last year. Let's put the money on the table and cover those deficits. That's the way the early stages of these intermediary organizations function. It was the last dollar guaranteed to a limited number of organizations. It was not a competitive process. People did not have to go through some complicated process. The assumption was they would have deficits. That's what it meant for them to be providing these social services. And so that from the late 19th century to the first third of the 20th century, and then actually to a large degree carrying through the 20th century, these intermediary organizations were the dominant force in the way philanthropy functioned for most people. And so that was development number one. Development number two took place in the middle of let's say the 1930s. And this also took place in most of the world, certainly in Europe and the United States. The rest of the world is a little bit of a different history. So for this, I'm restricting myself to the global north, and even took place slightly differently. But generally speaking, the response to World War I was not particularly insightful. It led to all sorts of unintended consequences, tremendous levels of poverty, and depression as time went on. By the time we got to the end of the 1920s and into the 1930s, we saw Great Depression in the United States. We saw equivalent depressions, economic depressions in much of Europe. They were so large that, depending on what city you're talking about, 30 to 50% of the population was unemployed. It was also the time in the United States of the Dust Bowl, when places which previously had produced crops and food for everyone were no longer functioning in ways of were no longer able to do so. So there were food shortages. Whatever one's politics in the 1930s, it became clear that the private sector was far out of its ability to pull American citizens out of their poverty, out of their hunger, out of their need. And so it led to the passing of the New Deal. What is the New Deal? It meant that the United States, for the first time, 150 years after we saw in Europe, for the first time said we have a social responsibility to provide for our citizens. Our social responsibility means that we have to provide security for them. If they cannot find a job, If they get too old to work, if they're too sick to work, we have to give them enough so that their lives are secure. Therefore, it's called Social Security. The government will give enough money for somebody to have the cost of living covered. I know that's hard for people in the United States to believe today, but that was the underpinning of the Social Security system. It expanded over the next few decades to the Great Society, the development of Medicare, the development of food stamps and SNAP funding, and all sorts of other ways in which the society took more responsibility than it ever had before for creating a safety net for its citizens. Now, parentheses here, comparing the American safety net with the European safety net. The American safety net was always more porous than the European safety net. For all sorts of reasons, and some of it had to do with race, some of it had to do with deep-seated endemic classism. Some of it had to do with anti-immigrant sentiment. Some of it had to do with this very potent commitment to individual liberties, that there was a limit to how far people were willing to let government go. In a few minutes, we're going to come back to that when we get to the 21st century. Nevertheless, from the 1930s on, it was true that American society, as in other parts of the world, took responsibility for core human need in a way that it had never done before. Now, this is what led to another unintended consequence. By the way, if you notice, so far, nothing about what I've said before up until now has to do with public policy leading to incentives for philanthropy. All of the development of philanthropic systems that we've talked about so far were emerged out of need, not because of government intervention. We only later on began to see the tax system have some incentives for philanthropy to come into existence. But up until now, even up until this very moment, the development of Social Security was not accompanied by let's make private philanthropy more enticing by giving a tax write-off of some sort. That's a whole different discussion about the tax system. But suffice it to say, our philanthropy and most of the rest of the world the motivations for philanthropy rarely are driven by tax deductibility. They're almost always driven by other incentives of people wanting to make the society better, of voluntarily giving of personal resources for social good. People may use taxes as a way to decide how they're going to give, but rarely to decide if they're going to give, and every study has shown that. Nevertheless, let's move ahead. If you're a person who up until then was always giving because there was an objective need that you cared about, one could legitimately look in the mirror and have this discussion. By the way, the discussion I'm about to describe never really happened, but it was implicit. Gee whiz, I used to give because objectively, if I didn't give, nobody else would. Now I don't need to. The government is taking care of those people. I'm going to give money to the things I care about. I care about my university. I care about the opera. I care about the theater. I care about libraries. I care about all sorts of other kinds of things in my community that are meaningful to me. I'm going to make decisions about where to give my money based on my subjective interest, not necessarily based on objective need. Now, in fairness, let's be clear. From that time on until this very moment, it's not as if nobody ever gave to people who were impoverished or people who were ill or people who were otherwise in need. It's not as if that stopped happening. But the basis of the decision was not necessarily based on objective need. It was based on subjective interest. What that led to was another profound change in the way philanthropy worked. The development of an entirely different way of thinking about philanthropic institutions. It made philanthropic institutions competitive. If you're going to make a decision whether to support the opera or the theater or the library or your alma mater or some other institution based on what matters to you, gee whiz, I better, if I'm representing those institutions, I better know how to make a better case to you, philanthropist, than somebody else. I better have a better case prepared. I better tell a better story. I better have better videos. I better have better mailings. I better have better phone calls. And so we began to see, beginning in the middle of the 20th century, philanthropy being a competitive process. Once it became a competitive process, funders had to say, gee whiz, I'm now in a position where I have to make up my mind between all of these people that are trying to make a good case for my resources. To be honest, that while some of the other parameters of this discussion are going to emerge and evolve over the next few minutes and during the course, basically that's where we are to this very day. Those of us who are philanthropists, those of us who give our money away, those of us who have foundations, essentially have the challenge of making decisions, hopefully good decisions, hopefully wise decisions, hopefully ethical decisions, hopefully informed decisions about where to give our resources and where we may choose not to give our resources. So the change that took place as a result of in Europe and in the United States about how about the competition for our dollars continues to this very day. So and so that really takes us on the whole through the 20th century, or toward the end of the 20th century. Here's another time, if you want to take a few minute break, get a cup of coffee and come back, this is a good time to do so. I'm going to continue in a couple of minutes. Okay. So the things began to change toward the end of the 20th century in different places around the world. In the United States, we began to see, starting with Ronald Reagan's presidency, but continuing beyond that, a kind of an anti-government, anti-tax sentiment. Let's go back to a time when government is intervenes less in our lives. We want to have those choices. We want to be able to make the choices ourselves. We don't want government to tell us how to do that. And what's the best way of keeping government out of our hair, out of our pockets? And that is to reduce taxes. If we reduce taxes, government cannot do as much. And as you know, and those of people in this call from some other parts of the world recognize that even in many parts of the world, and certainly still in the United States, many politicians will run on the basis of reducing taxes, not necessarily addressing the implication of what does that mean to social systems and support for those at risk. It came to probably its culmination from a government perspective under the time of George W. Bush. George W. Bush really believed as president that there were elements of American government that should be private. So, for example, all of you know that there was a tsunami in Indonesia and other parts of the world. It was a major international calamity. Most of the world put money on the table because it was clearly an international disaster. Under George W. Bush, America put a tiny amount of money on the table. But what President George W. Bush did is he turned to two past presidents, his father and Bill Clinton, past presidents, and say, go raise private money. We know that there's needs there. Americans are generous. Go raise money from them to support the needs of people in Indonesia and elsewhere in the world. All right, maybe one could make the case that, I'm not saying one should, but one might have made the case that that this was not really an American interest. This was other people's interest. So if people wanted to support people at risk, by all means, they could privately contribute to supporting tsunami relief, and millions of dollars were raised that way. It was not that long after, however, that there was a tremendous hurricane, a major hurricane in the southern part of the United States called Katrina. By this time, under President Bush, the emergency management system called FEMA had basically been depopulated. It would the amount of money provided for it had been cut off. The person who was running it was somebody who used to run a golf association, and it was just a shadow of what otherwise previously had been a world respected emergency management system. When Katrina took place, and millions, thousands and thousands and thousands of people were homeless in Texas, in Louisiana, in Mississippi, Alabama. The first thing George W. Bush did is, instead of sending American governmental support, he did the same thing that he did with the tsunami. He turned to the two past presidents, his father, George Bush, and Bill Clinton, and said, go raise money. And they did. But unfortunately, it takes a long time to raise that much money, and people were literally dying. We see the picture of people in the Astrodome, where there was no food, where there was no air conditioning, there was no facilities, and there was no hope because of government inaction. It took a full 10 days before the United States government began to realize what a mistake this was. And as a parenthesis, I will tell you that later in his life, George W. Bush has publicly acknowledged that it was the greatest mistake of his presidency. That if there was one thing that he would have done very differently, it was he would never have allowed that to happen. He would never have allowed the government to be so passive. But it was a reflection of this anti-government sentiment that had grown at that point. It became concretized, internalized even within the government. However, when Obama became president, he realized that was not possible. But he also recognized that, given the sentiment in the United States, that he recognized that there was never going to be support, at least during his presidency, there was never going to be support to reestablish the government support for all of these kinds of cutbacks, for human need, for educational need, for job training, and all and immigrant training and the like. And so he committed himself to intersector collaborations and partnerships. The private sector working with government, working with philanthropy, working with the with the nonprofit organizations, were the way in which human needs were going to be addressed. We're going to recognize that systemic issues are not solvable by any one sector. They require an intersector solution. So while he put the government back in the game, he never pushed it, for better or for worse. He never assumed that government could be the primary or the sole source of support for human need in the way in which it might in some other societies. So that takes us up to the end of the 20th, into the 21st century. Now, I want to talk about how there's a convergence at this stage between American system and the European system, and then we're going to talk about a couple of phenomena of the last few years. In the European system, in the Napoleonic system, there also was a recognition that there was a limit to government abilities. The society was getting larger. More people were getting education. More people were getting older and retiring. There were greater needs for housing. The capacity of even generous societies, such as in Scandinavia, to say nothing of other parts of Europe, to meet these kinds of needs, saw an endpoint. We saw resistance. We saw resistance to how to respond to immigrants from the East or from the South. We saw resistance when people began to talk about adding even token tuitions to university education. And so the Europeans began to turn to America and say, Javis, what can we learn from you about how American philanthropy works? And just one anecdote to illustrate this. When Jacques Chirac was president, his advisor for domestic policy was a woman named Valerie Terranova. And she went on a tour, came to the United States on a tour of the American philanthropic and social service system. And the State Department asked me to be the last person that she met with to review her visit and to better understand it. And the first thing she said to me, "Oh my goodness, this is so impressive. How do you think we can have such a system in France?" And I said, "Before you do that, I want to ask you some questions." And I said to her, "Can you imagine a French system which charges $50,000 to $70,000 a year for a university tuition? Impossible. Can you imagine a French system where people were totally dependent on their employer, whether they have health care or not, until they get to be a senior citizen?" Oh, that's not possible. This was before the Affordable Care Act. And I went down the list of areas where they just took for granted in the post-Napoleonic system, Europe in particular, but not only, in the industrialized society besides the United States. And I said, so before you romanticize and idealize the philanthropic system of the United States, take a good hard look at what the trade-offs are. And are you willing to take those trade-offs? There may be things to learn from America, but don't think that our philanthropic system is something to adopt. Rather, it's something to adapt to the needs of other parts of the world. But similarly, we in America recognize at this point that it's virtually impossible to solve systemic needs without government. There can be, to this very minute, there are tremendous arguments about what the scope of a government involvement should be. But we recognize that it cannot be done without there being a strong governmental system. Later on, when we're together, you're going to see some hard numbers that illustrate how the capacity of the private philanthropic system versus the government system when we look at our ecosystem as it exists today. But suffice it to say, in anticipation of that if you put all the philanthropic dollars together, it's only a drop in the bucket compared to what we take for granted has to be provided for education, SNAP funding, healthcare, housing, everything else. So let's be clear about that. That's where there was a convergence. But now what I want to talk about is we're really now talking about the end of modernity, where there was the assumption of what society could do, either in the United States or in Europe. And we began to be in the postmodern period where all sorts of things were up for grabs. And I just want to look at two phenomena of the last few years that illustrated more profoundly than anything else. The first is the response to the pandemic. Who would have imagined that there would be protests of thousands of people in the streets in Europe and the United States about mandatory vaccinations, or about certain behaviors that guaranteed the health of the society as a whole? But sure enough, the argument was, what right do you have to tell us that we need a vaccine? You can see by these pictures, not everybody thought that. The majority of people respected government involvement of this, but there were whole segments of society that had developed such an distrust of government that the very idea of vaccines, which had been so normative for so many years, was already a threat to their sense of who they were, the sense of our pursuit of happiness, our sense of radical individualism. That even something which guarantees that the health of the larger society, a commitment to the society as a whole, social comity, COMITY, was called into question. And so we saw, not just by small numbers of people, maybe not the majority, but by significant numbers of people in Europe, in the United States, and elsewhere in the world, people saying, what right does government have to tell us that we have to get vaccinated, even if our willingness to not be vaccinated impacts the health of other people? That's a significant challenge to what we assume it meant to be part of a modern society, modernity. What's philanthropy's role in that? Is there a role for philanthropy in that? Should philanthropy be supporting that individualism? Or should philanthropy be pushing for there to be an independent way for people to get vaccinated, or healthcare, Or is this none of philanthropy's business? It's a very open question as we begin to say, what does it mean for us to play a role in public policy with our private resources? The next challenge, and this is the one I'm going to leave us with, the next challenge emerges out of the challenge of equity, racial equity, economic equity, class equity, educational equity, disability equity, that have emerged over the last few years. It has all sorts of implications in two ways for philanthropy. Number one, it's a challenge to where our money should go. If we are serious about talking about making the society better, do we have a right? Is it responsible philanthropy for us not to be taking into consideration the inequities of our society? And those societies are based on people of color or gender or all sorts of other inequities that we acknowledge are there. We can no longer pretend that no matter what that Declaration of Independence said, that we live in a society where everyone has equal access and everyone has equal opportunity and everyone is devoid of xenophobia, is exempt from xenophobia or racism or anti-Semitism or Islamophobia. We see it played out too radically statistically in so many places in American society that any philanthropist, any foundation that says we care about equity in society is by definition forced to take into consideration how these challenges to what we're about have to be built into our giving. It doesn't mandate where we give. What it does is it requires us to think about it. But others go further. Others, such as the move to decolonialize and decolonialization, as some groups call it, say not only do we have to look at the continued existence of these inequities, but we have to take seriously the way in which our wealth was garnered. How many people of great wealth earned it with a level playing field? How many people with multi-generation wealth didn't depend on inequities of sweatshops or slavery, or in some parts of the world or in the United States, or derivative thereby? How many people were able to gather significant wealth, which make up our foundations, our philanthropists, our philanthropies, that can look back and say, my goodness, I earned it because it was a playing field and I really earned it, and everybody else who was in that playing field had an equal shot. Some, I'm not putting everybody down, but let's be fair, an awful lot of that wealth was gathered with an unequal playing field. There are those that say if it was an unequal playing field earning it, then that means that there's a particular responsibility for us to figure out what does it mean for us to still have responsibility, sole power, sole accountability for the money and the resources under our auspices. These are some of the challenges that are driving philanthropy today. Who makes those choices? How do we make those choices? That's what our time together is going to be about. I look forward to meeting you in person very soon and to spending that next time with you, exploring all of these things in much more depth and much more detail. Thank you so much.